Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Strongest Argument. I'm joined here today by Professor Ed Dutton and Dr. Paul Taylor, and we will be discussing the premise that postmodernism is not woke degeneracy and that the alt-right frequently gets postmodernism wrong. Professor Ed Dutton, could you give yourself a brief introduction, please?
Oh, hello. I'm Ed Dutton, and I have a YouTube channel called The Jolly Heretic, and I've written various books, most recently Woke Eugenics, How Social Justice is a Mask for Social Darwinism.
Dr. Paul Taylor.
Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Taylor. I just recently started a channel called Readers of the Lost Art, which I look at very depressing interpretations of art, philosophy and literature. The more depressing, the better. I'm a recovering academic, and I've written books in round about the area of postmodernism, but not precisely in it, but I'm sure we'll get to discuss the difference.
You are also a friend of Mr. Slavoj Žižek and former editor of the...
Oh, yeah, I ran the International Journal of Žižek Studies for quite a while, and I gave a public talk in London with Slavoj a while ago, years ago. And yeah, he's a lovely guy.
So, what do you think the position of the postmodernist largely is, Professor Dutton?
Me?
Yes, you.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
It seems to me that a lot of it is written in a highly impenetrable way, and an opaque way, which I suggest is really the reason why anybody writes in that kind of way is because they don't really have that much to say. So they dress up something trivial or trite as a profound insight by using all kinds of verbose language. I think Derrida is the best example of this, but there are others. All they really seem to be saying is that there is no such thing as a perfect system of categories. The world is chaos. The world is doesn't make any sense. And so we make sense of it by dividing it up into systems of categories. And those categories are useful to the extent that they allow correct predictions to be made, this sort of Aristotelian idea. Now, those systems of categories are never perfect. There will always be paradoxes, or there will always be certain things that don't quite fit into the categories. So, but that doesn't mean that we can't use those categories as a means of getting closer to the empirical truth. And the evidence of that empirical truth is really William James's test of pragmatism. You can't live by a philosophy that says that you can't know anything or you can't understand anything. And I also suggest that it's not true that you can't know anything or you can't understand anything, because I mean, we can calculate things. I mean, if you're going to live by that, you can't cross the road. And it seems to me that in general, they're simply dressing up that insight, which is an old insight, as something extraordinary, which means that we shouldn't be allowed to make clear truth claims. It's an anti-theoretical kind of idea, but taken far too far, as far as I can see, to sort of sow confusion. That's doubtless a simplification of it, and there's different postmodern philosophers that take different views. And Derrida is clear that he's not saying there's no such thing as truth, and so is Foucault. But it seems to me that's where it leads.
Dr. Paul Taylor.
Well, I give, if I was marking an essay, I give Ed a B+ because he's done much better than most people criticising postmodernism, because he actually, named a postmodernist. He named two, in fact. He spoke slightly about what they've said, although I wouldn't necessarily agree with his characterisation. But my response would be, as it often is in these instances, he'd need to be more specific about what they're supposed to have said. So, for example, there is a distinction between brute facts and institutional facts. Brute facts means that no postmodernist, including Derrida and Foucault, would ever worry about going into a sound building because it's going to fall apart, because they do believe in basic physics. They believe in the brute facts of physical causality.
Okay.
Where their relativism comes in is in institutional facts, which are to do with how we structure our society.
Okay.
And immediately, I just disagree with that there is an empirical, verifiable truth in society, because that presupposes you're looking at society from a scientific point of view, which isn't appropriate unless you're in a laboratory with a wad of investigative machinery, when society doesn't lend itself to that.
think Ed's probably the perfect person for this. You were criticised by David Starkey recently for being a crass Darwinian.
And then I said to him, well, the fact that you call me a crass Darwinian, the fact that you engage in rhetoric, that you engage in appeal to insult, only demonstrates that on some level you realise that I'm probably right and you don't like it, and that's why you engage in fallacious...
are you claiming...
That's why you engage in fallacious argumentation, to which he said, oh, well, I mean, are we here having an academic disputation, or are we having a discussion, in which case surely rhetoric is appropriate? I was like, no, rhetoric is not appropriate. Rhetoric is never appropriate when you're engaging in what I thought was an academic disputation. It was an academic disputation until I pointed out a flaw in your argument, and then suddenly it became a friendly chat in which it's okay to use rhetoric. And I don't agree. I would give Paul's analysis there a B+. I mean, he's at least tried to understand the nature. No. Perhaps a B. He's tried to understand the nature of science and whatever, but he has not fully done so. This idea that you can't apply scientific principles to societies. You can apply scientific principles to chimpanzee societies via zoology, and there is no reason, when you consider that humans are an advanced form of ape, that you can't apply scientific principles to human societies. The fundamental notion within science is consilience, that if you make an assertion within, let's say, sociology, that has to be reducible to the lower science, psychology. Make it in psychology, that has to be reducible to biology. Make it in biology to chemistry to physics, and so on. Now, it is true that you can distinguish between different definitions or different kinds of truth, and it is true that there is, with science, for example, there is a difference between the scientific method carried out ideally and the truth claims that result from that, and the guild, if you like, of science, which if you go into these people, whatever, Chomsky or...
The guild of science.
The guild of scientists, yeah, and their truth claims. So the kind
institution of science.
The institution. So this Thomas Kuhn, whatever, the way that science actually operates, which is imperfectly, because it involves corruption, as against what science as an ideal is supposed to be. Now, it's true there that I think that someone like Foucault has a point where he says that the notion of what is... he gets a notebook so he can write down his ideas, but I don't. I just have to...
You can have
I
one.
wasn't aware this was an offer to us. But bias originally, the scales are against me from the start.
Postmodern technology, a pencil, a piece of
do
paper.
you want a pencil and a
Highly
piece
modernist technology. I could have one.
Do you want a pencil and a piece of paper?
That would
I have
be
a
all
piece of
right.
paper. Yeah. Do you
Okay.
have a spare pencil for your opponent? That is just poor sportsmanship.
Oh, thank you.
I want the better one.
Right, sure, okay. So I think that difference is real, and when he looks at something like the issue of madness and how it's defined over time and how its borders change over time, there is some truth in that, but that it doesn't mean that we can't say that there's some fundamental almost biological comprehension of what is madness that doesn't really change across time that much, which is that it's maladaptive, people that are mentally maladaptive to a very fundamental degree.
Were you aware of this distinction between brute truth and institutional truth?
Yeah, I understand what I haven't heard it put in those terms, but again, if they're going to say things like they can say as much as they like that they believe, and they do say this. Derrida has said this, Foucault has said this, that there is such a thing as objective truth. I'm not saying there's no reality. But if you're going to argue as they do that we're going to subvert all systems of category, we're going to always notice that there's this issue with this category, and we're going then what that leads to is the idea that you can't really be sure of anything. Okay. And if you can't be sure of anything, you can't be sure of any kind of objective truth, even at the scientific level. And they've also argued, or Derrida has argued, I think, that reason itself should be understood as a sort of almost an oppressive Western discourse, which itself needs to be problematized. Well, if that's the case, then the implication is there's no such thing as objective truth.
Dr. Paul Taylor, your response?
Well, do I get twice as long because he speaks twice as fast as me? That would be my first point.
I was just thinking about that problem.
Yeah. First of all, there's a slight performative contradiction. Ed basically has become the rhetoric police and has said no one's allowed to use rhetoric. The ancient Greeks would be fascinated to learn that. And also then proceeded to give a rhetorical spiel.
I haven't given
where he made, you made a load of statements like the only objective truth is scientific truth, which is a rhetorical, almost political statement, in the sense that render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Science is good for understanding scientific problems. Science has no prior claim on understanding language claims, which human society is based upon language. Ed then made a metaphorical claim that people are advanced apes, which David Starkey would probably again say that's rhetorical, Ed, because we have similarities with apes. You could even claim that we're advanced apes, but for example, I don't understand this. I would struggle to see the scientific proof that an ape has ever exhibited the linguistic facility and versatility of Shakespeare, or ever could.
What's a language claim? Sorry, if I don't know it, the audience might not know it.
Sorry, in what context?
You said language claims, that there are that our society is based on language claims.
Sorry, our society is based upon language. I think we could agree that much.
Yeah. No.
Why? Why would we agree that?
Hang
Right.
on.
Well, thought. Right. I'll make a claim then. Thought is not possible without language. Would you agree to that?
No.
Right. Could you tell me your pre-linguistic thoughts, please?
Well, no, obviously not. But I must have.
Well, then you can't. You can't have a thought if you can't enunciate it.
How's that the case? Surely
You can have a differential response. So a thermostat in a house can, in a sense, tell you whether today is warmer than yesterday. So you could claim that's a thought, but it's not. It's a differential response.
Surely you could claim that dogs and cats have thoughts.
No, they have differential responses.
They have dreams.
Well, right, can I... Because he's now interrupting me.
I'm not interrupting you. We're having a conversation.
You did pose the question to her, but yes, carry on.
Well, then I don't know how it quite works, because I interrupted him earlier and was told not to.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think the idea was that you were interrupting me at a key and interesting point.
But you just asked him a question. Wait,
Yeah,
okay.
All right,
Now,
well, fine
carry
then. I
on,
won't ask him questions.
Carry on,
which is
carry
a
on,
shame.
carry on. You can, but please
Right,
carry on.
because I get frustrated when people say postmodernism is that, postmodernism is that, or this or that, and they never define it. So it is slightly disputable that Richard Rorty is a postmodernist. And this is where all the categories do. This is an example of categories not being fixed. I think Richard Rorty has a lot of things he says as a neo-pragmatist that draw upon postmodern thinking.
Okay.
And he defines, along with later Wittgenstein and other, Donald Davidson is another key theorist of language, they make the quite bold claim that humanity is defined by language.
Okay.
It's what makes us human. It's what makes us not an ape. And human thought is only possible through language. So a quick example would be a grass does not give a flying toss whether it's green or not.
Okay.
We give the quality of green to grass.
Yes.
And there is a whole history of the Enlightenment thought where they were trying to Kant had this notion of the Ding an sich, the thing in itself.
Yeah.
When you're worried about whether reality is an accurate representation of what you're thinking, so it's called the correspondence theory of truth. If you define truth as there's an objective reality out there, and when we recognize it properly, then that's the truth.
Yes.
Well, lots of theorists of language would just completely say it's a bogus metaphysical, only philosophers are bothered about that.
Okay.
We exist in the world in lots of pragmatic, realistic ways, and we do that through language. So I'd argue someone like Ed, who's wedded, like the dogmatic church fathers, to science, which has replaced God as the guarantor of truth, the dogmatism that only science can provide truth.
Well,
Wait. He's going to finish his exposition and I'll hand over to you, Ed.
Yeah, the dogmatism, and this I've seen Peter Boghossian be picked up. I recommend to viewers, there's a recent interview Peter Boghossian did with, I think he's German, but a German professor called Jan Bentz, B-E-N-T-Z.
Okay.
And they had this type of discussion, and Jan Bentz made a great argument that from the Enlightenment, Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. He was forced, because of this notion of does the external reality, do we represent it accurately? He's forced to reduce it, along with Immanuel Kant, to the idea that it's inside our heads.
Okay.
And the individual is ultimately the guarantor of an external reality.
Okay.
Through methods like science.
Okay.
The problem with that is that then you're faced with, if representation is the basis, so there's representations and then you recognize it as the truth. But to recognize it as the truth, there has to be a non-representation in your head that you recognize. Otherwise, it's just representation after representation after representation.
Okay.
So all of this Enlightenment thinking is based upon the individual. And this Jan Bent points out, we wonder why today people are even claiming their sexuality. It seems counterintuitive that in an age of science, people can decide what sex they are, never mind gender. And he traces all this to this Cartesian, everything relates to the individual and what's inside your head.
Okay.
It's highly individualistic. It has lent itself to the consumer society we now live in. It's not based upon language. So we now have the people, I think Ed and I would both agree that we don't like, the blue-haired crazies that often bark at public events rather than speaking. So science has its place. I'm not arguing it doesn't. But when it's in a society that lacks proper language skills, then they become the church fathers again. And that is a huge danger.
Okay. There's a few points for you there.
Well, there's quite a lot. Yeah, although I can't read my own writing very well. There you are. I don't.
Language.
First of all, when you talk about rhetoric, okay, it is true that you can't avoid. What I suppose I meant was fallacious arguments. So if you say something like a person is a crass Darwinist, what you are engaging in is an appeal to insult. This is a known, obvious fallacy. It is a manipulative way to argue. There is, I think, a difference between that and using metaphor to try to make sense of something, though it is true that you have to be careful with the nature of the metaphor, because sometimes the metaphor can then easily verge into manipulation, into poisoning the well, whatever, other kinds of fallacious arguments. Secondly, you make the point that it's almost as if you're saying that there's some sort of, we use the word dogmatic, some sort of arrogance to science, all in making truth claims. All those that are scientists are saying is that from a sort of common sense philosophy, Thomas Reid kind of idea, we have to negotiate our way through the world and make sense of the world. And so unless we're going to assume that we're living in some sort of computer game or something like that, we have to assume that our pragmatism, exactly, we have to assume that what we are perceiving with our senses is now just writing swear words on it to distract me. What we are perceiving.
If you're going to read my notes, I'll write them for you.
All right, what we are perceiving with our senses is true. So is an accurate understanding of what is around us. And that is all science is saying. And if you're going to try to argue that there are somehow different ways of understanding the world other than empirically, then you're getting into a kind of idealism or a rationalism or whatever. This idea that there are certain a priori truths that we just know. And we just know without empirical evidence.
Can I ask a question?
No, because I'm talking. And once you get there, then it seems to me you potentially get into this kind of metaphysical world of idealism, whereby you can just say, "Oh, I intuitively know there's a God," or I just know that, or I just know there's a certain kind of world which is the unfolding of everything into the absolute, or whatever it happens to be. And you're in this kind of highly just speculative, almost quasi-religious kind of idea. So I would be more inclined to say, well, that's going to go nowhere. And I would agree with David Hume, metaphysics, burn it. It's just speculation and nonsense, and it gets you absolutely nowhere. There's one way to get to the truth, and that is it is the method of science, reason plus the empirical method, when done properly, as opposed to the corruption that you get in institutional science, which has results. So I don't think that's a new church father or a new dogmatism. The nature of science is that you are open to being wrong, but that doesn't mean that you can't make any truth assertions or you can't know anything.
No, the dogmatism I'm referring to is the dogmatic insistence, like Peter Boghossian and like you, that you apply science. Remember I said render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. There are areas of life that aren't hospitals. I don't want to be treated by a witch doctor. I want a real doctor. I don't want to go into a building that's been designed by someone with my engineering qualities. So it's a red herring, and this is what scientists do. I am not critiquing science in its place. I am critiquing science trying to explain things it is not qualified.
What is it not qualified
For
to explain?
example, if you and I wanted to understand why have we got blue-haired, illiterate, crazy people in our society, how are you going to explain it? You're going to put them in a lab? Are you going to give them electrodes to their brains? No, seriously. If you want to explain certain problems, they're not scientific problems.
That is.
No. History is important. Literature is important. All these fields of human endeavour. I would not, because before you critique, you should understand. I would never critique about science, a scientist and his work, because I don't know enough. So therefore, I don't understand what gives a scientist the right to critique a sociological study, a historical study. There are separate realms of human knowledge that have their own. Well, that's news to historians.
Well,
that's news to literary people.
That's the problem with historians.
So you're not being dogmatic, but you're insisting that there is only one form of reason.
Yes.
So that's not contradictory.
Reason is reason. So there is inherently...
No, there's scientific reason.
No. There is reason. Logic is logic.
Right,
reason
so
is reason.
I'm clarifying. You are insisting on your definition of reason as the only definition of reason.
Obviously, because if we are to be able to have any kind of discussion, we have to be clear on what we mean by the terms.
Well, for example, objective realism. Would you accept that as a term?
I'm not familiar
Well,
with
I'm trying to find a term that we can agree on.
I agree on the term reason.
Right, I'm giving you a different term. I'm asking you.
I don't want another term because that's just kind of confusing things.
It's not confusing things because I'm rejecting your use of the term reason.
You know perfectly well what you mean by reason. You mean logically coherent arguments. So
but you're not presenting a logically coherent argument. That's why we're disagreeing. So we need to agree on what reason is.
I am presenting a logically coherent argument.
You're being dogmatic.
So I'm being dogmatic because I'm disagreeing with you.
No, I'm trying to find common ground. So I'm trying to go away from the word reason because we're never going to agree. Because I'm suggesting, with respect, we have a different conception of reason.
Well, then we can't do because reason is as it is understood.
Richard, this is where you could possibly intervene on the basis.
So let's.
If I'm accusing him of being like the original church fathers and dogmatic, and then he exhibits dogmatism, isn't that by the scientific reasonable demonstration?
Let's pull focus for a second because there's a couple of points that have come up. Let's just do this as a very simple exercise. How would you define reason?
I just said that as it would be defined as the logical, coherent argumentation. That is what reason is.
How else could reason be defined?
Well, for example, language. I'm not an expert in language theory, but language often, unless you reduce it to pure logical, analytical philosophy, language is by its very nature ambiguous. Yes. And it's not accurate. Okay. So if Ed wants to insist that German people who use idiomatic expressions, and I fear I'm going down a dangerous path here.
You be careful.
That they're not allowed to, or Spanish people when they say tomar el sol for sunbathe. Yeah. Is it unreasonable that the way they describe the world, because, as Heidegger said, language is the house of being, we can't conceptualize thoughts unless we use language? Scientific language is often reduced to algebra and mathematics, and it's a particular form of language which simplifies and abstracts so that it can then make things. It makes the truth.
Okay.
Sorry, it discovers the truth.
Yes.
But with language, you could argue language makes the truth. So there's discovering truth out there, I think, according to Ed and lots of scientists. Yeah. There's a physical universe out there, and we discover the truth. Okay. And I'm not disputing that. Yeah. But there's also human existence within that reality that Rorty would call contingent. There isn't. When would there be a point where we discovered everything there was about what it is to be human? When would be the point that we discovered that the Romantic poets were the limit of poetry? I think it was Waldo Emerson had this idea of concentric circles. The imagination creates a circle within which science and things operate, and then there's a bigger circle created. It's not a linear. Reason doesn't evolve along a linear path.
Just to be clear, before I hand it over to Ed, are you saying that we make the discoveries, language both limits the discoveries and then extends them because we're building a new reality with language?
Well, they're different types of discoveries. There is a scientific mode of discovering things that science is able to discover.
Within a specific linguistic structure, you're saying? Okay.
So Ed will use terms like truth as if, and this is why I'm disputing the fact reason. Okay. Truth and reason are eminently disputable in certain contexts. Okay. So narrowly defined scientific truth, I do not believe in witch doctors.
Okay.
So I believe in limited to its field scientific truth. But for example, if we had a couple in this room who'd just got divorced, do you think they'd share the same truth of why they got divorced?
No. And
does that mean neither of them has the truth?
Well, wait a second. Do you remember when we had this argument in here? You were sat here and I was sat there, and I was saying I didn't like behavioral psychology, and you said, why don't you? And I started talking about Freud and Jung and archetypes and that kind of thing. Is there no space for this idea that truth is relative, or do you have no?
You can. I mean, it just sort of reminds me of some sort of ridiculous undergraduate question where some highly intelligent.
Listen, how do I know that the colour blue
would say
is the same for me as it is for you?
Would say,
but insulting rhetoric is wrong.
Is it? Well, then why do you call me a dogmatist then?
That's factual.
No, it's not factual.
It is. If you insist,
it's an insulting.
Make your point.
It is clearly an appeal.
It's not. The Pope's dogmatic.
I'm
not insulting the Pope.
It is an insulting word in science to say someone's dogmatic. It's an appeal ad hominem.
I'm not a scientist. You can't tell me you're policing.
Wait,
politically correct. You're telling me the language I can use.
Stop.
All right. Well, okay, fine.
Fine.
Well, we can
There's
both
no in
both
here.
agree that Paul is being. But what I don't. But what I have.
One of those terms is redundant.
What I have to.
I knew we could get agreement.
I knew we'd get agreement. Inherently scout. But
Logical fallacy. Yellow card. Please finish your point.
No, I think dogmatism is an insulting. But anyway, the point. What was your? Yeah, you can certainly you can conceive of different notions of truth. You can say that there is empirical truth in the scientific sense, the correspondence theory of truth, and there is a degree to which you can say something like this novel or this poem is conveying a timeless truth about the nature of human life, or something like that. So it's a story, it's made up, but it's not scientifically true, or historically true, but it has certain truths in it that it's conveying about how things are. So I think you can use truth in that way. I don't think you can say something is true for me, because it seems to me that in general something is either true or it isn't. If a person did a sufficient investigation into it, they could probably come to a reasonable hypothesis as to realistically why a couple got divorced. Now, those couples might both have these ideas that are true for them as to why they got divorced. Oh, she was shagging around, or he was whatever. But in the general scheme of things, you could probably work out why it actually happened. As regards to the remark about the nature of history, history is simply the history of a group of humans, a group of humans across time. A group of humans across time are biological entities. And as I have said, with regard to E.O. Wilson's book, Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge, how science operates, and I think this is quite reasonable, is that you can reduce whatever the higher discipline is down to that which underpins it.
And what do you lose?
Ultimately underpins history. What history is the zoology, the historical zoology of humans, and therefore you can make reasonable predictions about how human organizations will develop across time, and this is why theories of the rise and fall of population seem to have a clear scientific basis to them, based around certain factors which will alter across time, because we are animals subject to evolution, and this will result in certain performance of behavior across time, which will be seen across history. History, to a certain extent, can be seen as the history of human evolution.
Are you worried about losing anything in the reduction?
No.
So no, well, I think we found agreement. What I'm hearing is that
nice bit of therapeutic language there.
I've learned. What I'm hearing is that Ed is a glorified turf accountant.
What's a turf accountant?
Bookie.
What's turf?
That's what they used to call bookies.
When you run on,
when you make a bet on the horses.
When you bet on the horses, turf accountant.
A turf accountant.
It's
they set the odds.
a posh way of saying a bookie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
Hyacinth says, she made a turf accountant.
Right, so Ed's wearing a cravat, so he's a turf accountant. Okay. He's reduced, dogmatically said, people are biological entities.
He hates this dogma thing.
I know, right, but fine.
Right,
you need to stop insulting people then. If you're going to call them biological entities, I'm claiming that's an insult.
How's that an insult?
It isn't.
You're not bothered to insult?
No, it's not an insult, just like dogmatic isn't an insult.
May I please?
I never knew I'd be with a pearl-clutching biological bloody scientist.
Please interject. Why do you find dogmatic? Like, obviously, everything we say is dogmatic.
No, if you're saying someone's dogmatic, you're saying they're being unreasonable. Aren't you?
Yes.
Right. Well, so that's not.
Oh,
that's,
okay.
that's an appeal to
Well,
insult.
I
So
was
stop
trying to
doing
make peace there, and apparently,
You can make a series
why
of
don't you try and make- why
you
don't
can
you-
make a series of reductive statements like people are biological entities. I would suggest that is a sentence with meaning, but it's not the truth, because I would say people are also biological entities with language that no other biological entity has. No other biological entity has the human capacity of language like we do. Ergo, we're a pretty anomalous biological entity if you want to keep insisting dogmatically
I'm not insisting
on that
dogmatically.
definition.
I'm not insisting it dogmatically.
So why are you saying people? You define people as biological
But
entities.
people are biological
Richard
entities.
picked up.
You
Yeah,
can't
that's
possibly
true.
say that's not true.
That's true.
Unless you believe in a dualism.
No, it's true with a small t in a scientific sense. But when you say that's all people are, that's the reductionism, that's the dogmatism, and that is factually wrong.
It's not factually wrong.
We're not just biological entities.
We are.
well,
In the sense that, as I said, if we are, well, there's an anomaly. We are the only recorded biological entity with advanced language
You could
skills.
say that any biological entity in so
Right,
much.
find me another one. Find me another one with language skills.
I
Allow
won't find you another one with language skills, but I will find you another one which has some specific skill which only that biological entity has. I could say ticks. Ticks are unique. They are the only biological entity who, being blind, hangs around on the edge of grasses and jumps up to you and bites you. They're the only biological entity who does that because that's their niche.
So can they-
Our niche happens to be a niche that is so narrow that it has involved the development of language.
do you
and thought.
Fine, but that
Right,
you
but
can't-
no
there's
other entity, biological entity
and I
can
can
think
give you,
like
and I
we
can
do.
say that no other entity has done the exact things that swans do.
this thing of language, the language models that we use limiting how we receive scientific data. Do you think there's validity to that?
I think it's just basically a distraction from getting to try to understand the true nature of things.
Well,
And I think it's if we're going to use all this rhetoric and insulting language, I think
It's
just pretentious. It's a whole of metaphysics.
I'm offended. I've been called pretentious.
but
Well, you started it.
the
no, but I'm offended. I'm clutching my pearls.
your most of your scientific experiences in psychology.
Well, I suppose so. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I say I'm going to do a psychology test on somebody and I walk up to them and say, "How selfish are you?"
Mm-hmm.
Is that a scientific question?
Well, you could make it scientific. You'd have to be able to quantify it. So the way that you would quantify it is you would give them a scale, and you would ask them to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 7 or something as to how selfish they were, and then you would compare that to other people.
Can I give you a wanky postmodern answer to that?
Mm-hmm.
What if when I say selfish to you in your culture or wherever you're from, it doesn't mean what I mean when I say selfish? Isn't that a problem?
It's a very serious problem. So you would make sure that there was a clear understanding of what. But that should, in general, though, that can be assumed in any kind of functioning society. The way we communicate via words is via having the same kinds of a mutual understanding of what these words mean. Now, then, the problem is that words then cross over into other areas of power or a status or whatever, and so then you will get people that deliberately redefine words so they can fit themselves into, let's say, the prestigious category. So you get all kinds of issues like that. So you have to keep an eye on that. So obviously, if you ask someone about being middle class, now we all used to understand what that meant, and now it's become stretched out of all credibility. And so you couldn't possibly ask a person in a survey, I suggest, what class are you? Or if you could, you wouldn't actually be getting at the sociological question of what class they were. You'd be getting into their kinds of attitudes and things like that. So certainly it's true that there is. I've never said that that there is some perfect system. The whole idea in science is that you come up with what you might call cautious essentialism. That I think was it Karl Popper that used that term. I can't remember. But cautious essentialism, the idea that you come up with a system of categories in order to better make sense of the world. It is a useful system insofar as it permits correct predictions to be made. That is an empirically testable proposition. But they will never be perfect, and you will always find there are certain anomalies and certain things that don't quite fit, and so on. And it seems to me, going back to what the key topic was of postmodernism, what they are generally doing is highlighting contradictions, paradoxes, whatever, issues with these categories and saying, oh, well, look, this is a bit unstable or this is a bit uncertain, to which I just think, well, so what? Aristotle understood that. There's no, and then you get this. I was trying to move this on earlier before we started about the issue of art. I find this very interesting. We used to have an understanding of what constituted art. Art has certain rules to it. This makes it art, and they reflecting this postmodern kind of idea of questioning categories subvert that, and you get to a point in the first extreme case where you say, well, art is just anything an artist produces. And you get Manzoni, who cans his own shit and sells it as art because it's come from an artist's arsehole.
How? What a lovely phrase. How would you... That's a reasonable statement. How would you,
because he keeps conflating categories. So, for example, Rorty is called, there's a clue in the title, a neo-pragmatist. So if I could ask you, Richard, do you think pragmatism's involved anywhere there? So this idea that pragmatism is a uniquely scientific quality. There's a guy built a whole sodding philosophy on using knowledge that is useful. So, for example, me, and like, who cares what I think, but Rorty's defense of science is that in the objective world of causal relations, nothing is more useful than science.
And he is a postmodernist?
Well, this is, yes, in certain ways. I think he had referred to himself jokingly. He shares qualities, as I said earlier, with some postmodern tenets.
Yeah.
So, for example, he thinks you can learn from history, which Ed doesn't. Ed thinks you can predict, like a turf accountant, the odds, which even then I'd probably agree, except I'd resist the temptation to reduce biological entities, stroke chest feeders, stroke people, to just statistics. I'm old-fashioned that way. Can I finish?
Why?
Because people are more than statistics. You use words like pragmatic, and I'm giving you that pragmatism. You're not giving anything to the argument that language is inherently... No, because I'm trying to give an example to anyone watching, the idea that I'm prepared to say, what is the strength of your argument? You get upset and clutch your pearls like a woke person when I say you're being dogmatic. We don't need to have epistemological humility. We do need to get upset when we don't show epistemological humility, accuses us of being dogmatic. We really need to get upset about that.
What is this notion of
and
this is just manipulative
we can't allow anyone to use rhetoric, metaphor, or point out that language by its very nature, which is still a point Ed's refused to address, language by its very nature is inherently ambiguous.
Yes.
So in anything that's ruled by language, i.e. human society, you have to try and understand ambiguity.
100%.
No one is disagreeing. I'm not disagreeing.
You won't understand ambiguity.
I'm not disagreeing.
Gentlemen, I actually didn't give Ed the chance to get to language. I took him off in another direction.
I am not disagreeing that, as I said, cautious essentialism. So it is axiomatic to science that you are cautiously essentialist, that you are open-minded within science to your hypotheses being wrong, that you present hypotheses, that you gather the evidence and you test them. And if they are wrong, then you should, obviously often scientists don't for institutional reasons and so on, but you should then abandon that model and move on to or test for a different model or whatever. So no one is saying that epistemological humility, no one is saying that you should, as you're using that term, dogmatic. You shouldn't be dogmatic. You should, in any scientific proposal, be open to the possibility that you are empirically wrong. You should look for you should make a point of trying to find counter evidence to your hypothesis. That is how science works. What I find very difficult to deal with is this render unto Caesar's what is Caesar. No, science, by its very nature, is an all-encompassing model. There is no space. It's not factually wrong.
It is.
There's no point saying it's factually wrong.
It's dogmatically true.
Let it be dogmatic. Good. Science is saying that everything, the whole world, can, on some level, be understood scientifically. History can ultimately be reduced to science. You accuse people of being reductionist. I think you're basically making things more complicated than they are, and so they want to come across like they're profound or whatever, and they dress up what they're saying in flowery, verbose language when they're actually saying something quite trivial. And it seems to me that Derrida, for example, is saying something utterly trivial, which is that there are problems with categories, that you can't be 100% certain of anything. You know, language is ambiguous, and you can never perfectly express things. Fine, so what? The Greeks were saying this kind of thing.
And he
what?
cites them.
So he does. So he's got nothing original to say, and all he does is get things that Plato or whatever has said, and then just dress it up in it's almost like a kind of art. It's not philosophy or science. Dress it up in some sort of funny word game. You know, this kind of thing with that literally glass, where he gets two biographies and puts them side by side to just seem clever. I do not understand.
Is philosophy art?
Well,
or is it science? Because you make the distinction.
If it is art, and then it's meaningless to have a concept of philosophy. There has to be an understanding of what philosophy is.
No, but you just sorry, but this is important. You distinguish between art. You distinguish between science and philosophy.
Well, because science is supposed to be around. It's to be quantitative, and it's supposed to be based around a gathering of empirical evidence.
Right, but I'm confused now because you were claiming that science can explain everything. So why would you need philosophy?
Science can explain everything in the material world.
Which is what I've been saying all this time, and you were saying, no, you should be able to apply science to everything. And that's why I've been getting frustrated.
You should be able
accusing you of being dogmatic.
No, I didn't accuse you of being dogmatic. I accused you of being...
No, I accused you of being dogmatic.
Oh, right.
Because you were saying that science can explain everything. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. The whole point of that is, the corollary is, there are areas of life that philosophy might be better examining the world. And you've just distinguished between philosophy and science.
So
I'm now very confused, because in your world, there isn't room for philosophy.
Philosophy,
so why use the phrase?
Philosophy would presumably be trying to understand the nature of the underlying logic that is, which is very far down the pyramid.
In your world, science explains everything. Why do you need philosophy's help?
No, you would need reason, and so that's when you get down.
But you know what reason is, and science only uses reason. So why do you need philosophy?
Science, I know I have a definition of reason, but you can still use.
We'll just use reason and be scientific. Why do you need philosophy?
Well, okay, it's a good point. Perhaps you don't.
I want to give you the opportunity to make the case, Dr. Paul, that postmodernism is a useful way of looking at things, and then I'm going to give Ed the opportunity.
Right. One thing I think maybe we could find common ground, because I think one of the subtexts of today's chat was supposed to find maybe ways in which more conservative thinking people could actually use postmodern thought.
And they do. They actually do already.
Yeah, and they should.
But over to you.
Yeah. Well, when I first spoke to you, I'm guessing about 18 months ago, we had a chat, and I was saying that one of the major problems in society today is people don't read. And I was convinced about that intuitively and instinctively, but I hadn't really got the framework to really argue it. And having read a lot more Rorty and people like that, I am convinced that the lack of language, and I think Ed would hopefully agree with me, undergraduates, high school kids, we can discuss the reasons why, but effective literacy. There was an article in, I think, the Telegraph recently by Oxford Don, which is when people finally listen, when an Oxbridge person says something. He was saying in Oxbridge English classes, I can't even say it, in Oxbridge English classes, he's starting to have to give shorter books. So in previous years, he would have said, read 3 large Dickens novels. And are you cheating things up?
I'm just checking something out.
Right.
Can you text the girls and tell them to shut up?
Shut up!
Shut up!
So, what was I saying? This distraction. We've got this. People can't concentrate anymore because they're on screens. Is part of my argument.
Just looking at boobs.
Well, it doesn't fit with it doesn't fit with the repressed aspects of Ed that you and I both are very familiar with, does it, Ed? But anyway, I'll carry on. There is a problem with reading, and this Oxford Don was saying, Oxbridge students aren't reading. They physically can't read as much. They can't read difficult books.
That's very sad.
It is very sad. But the point is, it has consequences. And I find there's Andrew Gold, there's these type of discussions. I find YouTube full of this endless cyclical discussion of woke. And I don't think many of these discussions ever get near the root causes.
Okay.
And I would suggest the loss, you may hate postmodern theorists, you may think they're saying simple things in overly complex ways, but one thing you can't take away from them is their engagement with the classics. Derrida engages with the Bible, Old and New Testament. He engages with Plato and the differences of meaning. Foucault devoted his later 10 or 12 years to dealing with ascesis, care of the self. And he had a beautiful idea called paresia, which is a Greek idea, which is basically speaking truth to power. It's speaking truth when it endangers yourself.
Okay.
So Socrates being prepared to die for his truth. And, you know, the Socratic method that people like Peter Boghossian rely upon. So all this classical learning, all this classical knowledge, throw the postmodernists out, and what are you left with? You're left with an increasingly technocratic university system that's based upon operational knowledge. So in French, Francois Lyotard wrote in 1979 one of the key texts that described postmodernism.
Okay.
It was called The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge. And it's been misattributed that he came up with the term postmodern. He didn't. He actually says in the first few sentences, this is a common term used in academia. And I'm doing I think it was paid by the Quebec government to do a full report on it. And because he's French, he distinguishes between savoir, which is knowledge, and connaissance, which is knowledge in a different way, because they have two words. They both mean knowledge.
Yeah.
But connaissance is learning. It's like, I would describe it as training.
Okay.
Savoir, like savoir-faire, is enculturated knowledge you gain through customs.
Okay.
So I would suggest, and I don't mean to be sexist, but hey, there are French women who may not be particularly attractive in an objective, scientific, ed-like way, who carry themselves in a certain way. And I would suggest with style and élan and all these French words, you could pick on French food, or let's not pick on the French. There are other cultures with savoir-faire. They know how to do things in a particular way. And he's suggesting, Lyotard, and I think it's been borne out by the university system, that ed would equally be as offended by some of the developments as I am. We've given ourselves over to connaissance.
Okay.
And we don't have savoir.
Okay.
And some of the postmodernists, Foucault in particular, analyzes, I've talked to you about epistemes. He analyzes the mechanisms by which culture gives people savoir-faire.
Yes.
Not as biological entities, but as living, breathing social animals.
But I'm saying that living, breathing social animals are
Social.
biological.
Social.
Yeah, but so answer social.
Right. No,
Answer
I'm
social.
emphasizing the social.
Wait,
You're emphasizing the biological.
Just one
I'm
second.
emphasizing social.
Just one second.
I
One
shouldn't be
second.
social. I agree with you though on the.
Stop agreeing with me. I don't want you.
We're coming to the agreement point. I want to try and get you on Andrew. Stop agreeing. It's not allowed.
I disagree with this agreement.
Oh, good. So Andrew
disagree with
Gold,
Andrew.
you want to help him get to the. You think he's going around and around? Woke?
No, I think we are. Sorry, I'm not being patronizing. We are.
Yeah. Okay. No.
So
no.
trigonometry, Andrew Gold, all these people.
Yeah.
It's the same topic. The woke this, the woke that.
Well, okay. So to be fair, I think Constantine's trying to break that because now he's talking about the woke right. I don't know if he's doing.
Let's woke squared. What does that solve?
Well, okay, but I'm acknowledging that he's acknowledging there's a
What are
problem.
the woke rights?
But he's not.
I don't know. James Lindsay and Constantine use the woke right. Let's not
Right,
get into
and-
that because I don't think
No,
it's useful.
fine. But can I just ask a very quick question?
Yes.
Will Constantine be pulling back since that James Lindsay, and I'd be interested in Peter Boghossian, given that James Lindsay now officially thinks that Saint Michael and Lucifer
Are in
and the
alignment.
Illuminati are taking over the world.
Listen,
He's the poster boy for anti-postmodernism, and I'm a defender of postmodernism.
saying
I'm the
being
mad
weird.
one.
You're being weird.
Yeah.
Okay, so Andrew Gold, you could help him maybe get to the point of the woke thing. He's a friend of the channel. He's a friend of Ed's. He's a friend of mine. He does Heretics. You watch Heretics. You like it. So maybe you could have a chat with him at some point. You would like to have a chat with him at some point. Yeah. Ed.
No, I agree. What's the name of that woman? The Indian woman that wrote the translation into English of Derrida's works.
I know who you're thinking.
You know who I mean?
Yeah.
And she made the point that deconstruction as a method is not inherently left wing.
Okay.
And it's not inherently woke.
Yeah.
It may be that it's become that way because a lot of philosophers have left-wing prejudices or whatever. But the idea of taking a set of knowledge that is asserted as factual and as true and as inviolable, such as the ideas of what are called woke people, and philosophically antagonizing it and showing where its structures are weak and showing where it's contradictory and showing where it doesn't make sense and showing whatever. That's not inherently, she argues, that's not inherently left-wing.
Well, it shouldn't be.
So you therefore should be able to, in theory, be a conservative deconstructionist, a conservative postmodernist. And I think it might have been Nima Parvini who was saying to me he was teaching philosophy of literature or something like this, and he was presenting his class with the method, how you do it, how you deconstruct stuff, whatever, and then he gave them left-wing texts and said, "Okay, off you go then."
Yeah.
And of course, they, on some level, intuitively knew. They understood exactly what was going on. They understood exactly what the assumptions were and what the categories were that were unsound or whatever, or had problems with them. But they knew, hang on, no, you can't do this.
Do you remember
shied away from it?
Do you remember I told you that at university on the feminism course, I took feminist literature and socially deconstructed feminist literature based on the tools they'd given me. And the woman who was running the course, she actually gave me a good grade for it, but she was like, "You are a cheeky fucker," but she still gave me it because I still applied their rules. So, what do you think of this idea that it doesn't need to be solely the territory of the left wing to be social constructionism seems to be what I found with postmodernism, the one thing that floats to the top that's actually quite useful. Would you agree with that? You could be a conservative social constructionist, deconstructionist.
Yeah, and there's other concepts. So Foucault had the notion of epistemes relies upon the way in which history, different ethoses in different historical periods. He goes, and one of the things is that
is that Foucault?
Yes.
You know who would love that? The podcast of the Lotus Eaters.
Well, I was going to say, in all these, thank you for reminding me. In all these discussions, so I've just picked out web channels that I think do a really bad job.
They would be disgusting if you said we have a Foucault idea for you.
They've done a video on postmodernism.
Okay.
And out of all the things I've seen, it was, I disagree with little. You're going to disagree with certain bits.
Yeah.
But it was one of the most even-handed, intellectually coherent, and intellectually. I think one of their researchers has done a PhD on Hegel.
Okay.
And it showed.
Okay.
He showed the material respect. He engaged with the actual text. They did do a bit of straw manning by generalizing.
Sure.
And that's what we all do. But the point is that I give you this, you validly said there are different postmodern thinkers.
Yes.
And they get lumped together.
Yeah.
But the Foucault as a defender of history, the idea that if you disagree with Derrida and you disagree with Foucault and you do it properly, you will have learned so much of Plato. You will have learned so much of the Bible. Excuse me. So if nothing else, from a conservative point of view, Foucault was returning people to classical knowledge.
Okay.
How is that? Rather than let's all do a management and business studies degree, which is the way the universities are going, and let's all do what I called operational connaissance.
Yeah.
The operational learning by rote, rather than actually learning to think critically.
So that's an interesting point there. So it means that the good thing about postmodernism from a perspective of a person who's interested in philosophy is that by disagreeing with them or questioning them or, in my view, unreasonably trying to argue that they don't make any sense or whatever, they are at least forcing you back to look at that literature, rather like the Church Fathers. So we've got literature, philosophical literature, that has only survived in fragments or as paraphrases because it has been critiqued by the Church Fathers. So the reason to read the Church Fathers, dogmatic, perhaps leftists of their time, a bit like the woke, whatever, is because at least they are talking about this philosophical or thoughtful or whatever literature in a way that wouldn't be the case if you didn't read the Church Fathers and you just did the 5th century equivalent of a business studies degree. Yeah. Okay, fair enough.
The thing I wanted to mention before about this, it's a sort of a postmodernist-ish idea, the social constructionist thing. Could you argue that it's there in science if you produce a paper and it's peer-reviewed and I'm your peer and I start pulling apart your assumptions? Isn't that somewhat postmodern, somewhat?
I don't know about that. I think it's perfectly modernist to critique a study by pulling apart its assumptions.
if I said to you that some of the language in here was based on assumptions that are culturally biased, the thing I alluded to before.
I suppose it would depend. It's certainly true that in science you should try as much as possible to use neutral language, and so this is one of the problems with social science that. For example, I'm writing this book at the moment about Jonathan Bowden, and I'm doing a section in it on as it were, the philosophy of fascism or whatever. But the problem is that is such a loaded word.
Yeah.
That I would think it would be reasonable for a peer reviewer to say, or far right, that's another one. It's one of these shut-up words. So I can see how it would be reasonable to demand that they use a different term. The problem is that precisely because that term embodies something which is seen as aberrant, whatever term they replace it with will always eventually become a term of that kind.
Okay.
A sort of insulting term or a term of abuse. It's like how they've replaced the word idiot or whatever was once a scientific term, and now it's so obviously a term of abuse that you would never write in a scientific paper once a person an idiot. But whatever the term is that comes to replace it, for example, retard. Now, in America, interestingly, that term is still more accepted, and it's still used in psychological literature. But in England, for some reason, it seems that it's more seen as an insult.
How did postmodernism get to become just associated with woke slop? I think I know, but...
Well, there's lazy assumptions. So they've borrowed. So the canard that winds me up like you wouldn't believe is when everyone says Foucault says everything is about power. No, he didn't.
He didn't say that.
No, he said power. I'm paraphrasing, but quite accurately, I think. Power is everywhere, but it's not everything. So in a family situation, are you telling me power doesn't exist in a family unit? Of course it does, but it's not the defining feature, or it would be a pretty unhealthy family if power was the only thing that drove that family. So what he's suggesting is it's very difficult to find any area of life that doesn't have power dynamics, but that doesn't have to be the defining. So he's saying, give power its due when it occurs and trace the mechanisms, which is a lot different to saying everything is about power, everything is about oppression, the powerful and the oppressed. Because Foucault also had a whole line of argument where I think I've seen one segment from an interview where it wasn't the days of identity politics yet at the time he was interviewed. He died in 1984, I think. He was basically saying he wouldn't fixate on identity because he said then you're in the control of the people creating the identities. And in fact, his work on sexuality was about when identities get imposed upon people, there's often an interesting reaction. So homosexuality, Ed knows much more about this than you or I do. But the history of homosexuality is actually people were put into the category from the Victorian to Freud times. And there were more and more classifications. And actually, then a gay culture was empowered by that because they were forced into almost like a ghetto.
Yes.
And from that, you get Stonewall, and from that, you get a lot of gay rights.
Yes.
So people react to power. Power, and he's gone on record, Foucault, in his work, saying power can be a generative force. It can create things. It's not the idea that it's just oppression. So the direct answer to your question is badly understood Foucault, badly understood Derrida. And I can testify, I'm not a fan of these theorists, ironically, but I know enough about them. Do not critique unless you understand. And the vast majority of university people teaching some of this stuff do not know it or do not refer to it. And you know the Cynical Theories book by Pluckrose and Lindsay?
Yes.
I had a quick glance at it because I'm thinking, what are they going to say about Foucault? There's very little actually said directly about Foucault or Derrida's work. I think they quote Brian McHale, a secondary source, talking about them.
Yeah.
And they make very general comments. Postmodernists say this. Peter Boghossian does that. Postmodernists say, and I'm thinking, A, they don't. B, who are the postmodernists? You need to define which one you're talking about.
Sure.
Richard Rorty was a defender of liberal democracy. Richard Rorty was hated by some on the left because he had certain postmodern qualities to his work. He emphasized the idea of contingency all the time. But he was a staunch defender of American liberal democracy. He said it was best by test. And why would you want to live in any other country having given the choice and people dying to get to America or dying on the channel to get to Britain?
Sounds based.
Exactly. No, in lots of ways, Richard Rorty was, and that's why he was very provocative, because he didn't, because he was a pragmatist. He said, I'm not going to espouse a socialist utopia. I want people's working lives to be better, and the best guarantor of that is the American Constitution. Well, that's not exactly relativist.
Is there anything, do you think, to rescue from postmodernism? Anything useful there?
Well, I think Paul made the point about if they're reading postmodern literature of a certain kind, at least this will draw them to engage with certain interesting classical literature or whatever. So that's one thing. Although I suppose you could say, well, look, just teach them to engage with the classical literature. We need to cut out the middleman. I suppose you could argue that some of the art that it has produced is at least interesting and thought-provoking.
Yeah. Ironically, that's where we'd probably disagree, because I can't stand postmodern art.
All of it?
It's me. I'm a Philistine. I need figuration of some minimum type. So there's a guy, Jean Fautrier, has these, like, they look like cow pats, but they call them the Hostage series, and there's human faces somewhere in there. There's a guy called Frank Auerbach. I'm not even sure I doubt they qualify as postmodern. They're modern, leaning towards...
If you think that art and the purpose of art is, in some sort of evolutionary sense, a group, something to inspire the group towards the transcendent or something like that, and that is an understanding of art, then perhaps postmodern art is not for you. If you see it as more just a wish to be intellectually and emotionally stimulated somehow, then I think you could say that the new neurotic realists or whatever do achieve that. Some of what they do may offend people, may be considered in poor taste, but it is at least interesting, and it makes you think, and it provokes discussion, and to some extent it might have some positive aesthetic qualities.
Yeah, my biased personal problem with conceptual art is if I want a concept, I read a book. And I find it, conceptual art is for people who don't like reading, is my jaundice.
Is church for people that don't like reading?
It can be.
I'm just saying that people want to have these.
No, I'm also being slightly facetious. I'm a card-carrying Philistine when it comes to modern art. Is what I'm just saying. Openly admitting.
You can say that making images of the Virgin Mary using cowpat is Chrysophilia, for example. Is highly offensive and disrespectful to religion. But he's making...
Well, a certain religion. My only point with him would be he's totally free to do it, but I'm pretty sure he's very careful about which religions he parodies.
True.
So that's cowardice in my book.
That is perhaps so.
Based.
So he's a conceptual cowardice. Coward.
Based.
Can we agree on that?
We could agree on that, but I'm just suggesting it was interesting to look at.
I'm sure.
That's all I'm saying.
When we hear figures like Jordan Peterson say, and he's been saying it for years.
Those damn postmodernists.
Those woke postmodernists.
The reason why I thought that I go out here.
But he sticks woke, postmodernist, and Marxist, neo-Marxist all together.
And it's contradictory.
What do you think of that? Do you think just let him say
it? You saw the debate he had with Zizek. And it was embarrassingly bad.
Marx is modernist, and I don't quite know what he means by neo-Marxist.
Well, the Frankfurt School and people like that.
School. Well, that's modernist?
No, but they were neo-Marxists in the sense they were post-Marx.
All right, okay, but they're not. I don't think you can say that they're postmodern.
No. But this is the thing. He lumps. Yeah, you're right. He lumps them all together in this.
You would agree it's a mistake.
He's
still informed.
Obviously, it's not. He's not correct about saying that postmodernism is neo-Marxist. That's a much earlier movement. You could say, I suppose, this is an issue we could get to. Well, where is the change from modernism to postmodernism? And you can say, in terms of art, what's going on? You have the crisis of representation. You have photography. You've had this idea that the purpose of art is to represent reality accurately, although there's a sort of propaganda aspect to it as well, a sort of a romantic idea. Why are we painting fields and things like this? We're painting it to inspire with beauty and related to a romantic idea. And then you have the rise of photography, and so suddenly there's a redundancy to art. How do they deal with that? They deal with that by making art more as expressionist, essentially. So it's about using the medium in a realistic-looking way, to express the emotions that are associated with the particular whatever Renoir or whatever, and then you move on from that to this kind of the Dadaism and this semi-surrealist idea, but you still have traditional notions of what art is, and certain qualities that make it objectively art, which is that it has to be sort of realistic to a certain degree, but it can be dreamlike. And then you're in the realm of Picasso and whatever. Then it gets interesting. Then you start questioning. Then I think you start questioning where's the borders of art. And so you could say that the seeds of postmodernism, of postmodern art, are existing right as far back as the 20s or the First World War, with something like, this is not a pipe or whatever, or the siding of a urinal. So then you're blurring the borders.
Duchamp,
right. So I think that's the beginnings, you could say. I'm not saying this is postmodern, but I'm saying it's modern or it's modernist, historically modernist. But that's where you've got the beginnings of this change, and also Cubism, perhaps even. The beginnings of this change, and what is art? How are we defining art? Where is art and not art? And then you have art as a kind of, you could argue, as almost a philosophical game, where it's about being original and unusual and questioning things, rather than about any kind of aesthetic or quality or anything like that. And then we're moving into the realm of pop art. And that sort of thing. We're into the 50s now, 60s, and you could say, now we've got postmodern art.
So, are you a modernist?
Am I a modernist? Well, I suppose you could argue that if you're interested in science and the scientific method, there's an extent to which postmodernism could be seen as some kind of reaction against that, against grand theories and things like this. And that they would accuse of being dogmatic or whatever, and they would say there are different ways of knowing, and that we should take seriously the knowledge of tribal peoples and all this sort of. Again, this starts in modernism. So even if you look into something like anthropology and you look in structuralism, then you have this idea that you should make that a tribe's way of thinking is almost self-contained. It makes sense within its own boundaries. And in its most extreme case, you have people like Levi-Strauss, who come up with almost a semi-mathematical way of structuring a culture. I had a friend at university whose doctoral thesis was a structuralist analysis of brythonic myth. So it's a way of doing things. You go back 30 years, they'd have done a Marxist analysis of brythonic myth. But now it's a structuralist analysis. And then we get into it being post-structuralist, where the very idea of a concrete theory of any kind is a problem, and you should just go into the field in anthropology and listen to what they say, and they have their truth and you have your truth, and you're biased, so actually you should analyse your own assumptions and your own feelings and all this. And that's where we then have, I think, postmodern. So there's no, I mean, that's a philosophical question. The idea that there's a clear border between modern and postmodern is itself a sort of thing that any good scientist or indeed postmodern critic would question. Am I a modernist? I suppose in the scientific sense, in that I'm happy to accept grand theories and what. Yes, I am. I suppose.
I saw a definition of modernism that said that modernists semi-cynically, they strive for ideals and they want the ideals, but they know that the ideals will crumble. And when I read that, I thought maybe that's where you and I often seem to meet, because we discussed this idea of God and Christianity, and that we wanted to live in a community where people believed in God, but where you yourself might not necessarily believe in God as such. Neither do I. So that's that.
Could I give a definition of that, a different one?
Please do.
Rorty describes what you're saying, the way you just described it, as someone finding fault with the representational model, but they actually still believe in it, but they keep finding the mirror that's supposed to reflect back. That's so much better than what I said. Right. Yeah. Well, that's because Rorty wrote this book, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. And his critique was philosophy and science are far too much trying to reflect accurately back this objective reality out there. So he referred to the person you're talking about who believes in the mirror but keeps finding fault as the epistemological skeptic.
Is that what Ed is? That's the name of his new channel.
Yeah. Well, that's but, and then one way to distinguish, Rorty would class himself as a skeptic of epistemology.
Okay.
So he doubts, and I saw you with Mark Vicenza, you were talking about epistemology and ideology. You veered towards, you were giving basic definitions, I'm not criticizing, but you veered towards Ed's by defining epistemology as quite almost like the unproblematic search for knowledge.
Yeah.
Whereas people like Rorty, this is the debate we've been having, he's saying there are dangerous presuppositions when you have presupposed categories. And Peter Boghossian does this all the time, and this is what Jan Bentz took him to task for. Because a bit like Ed, every time he tried to get Boghossian to say, well, why are you using science in this area? He was basically, I'm not saying this about you, Ed, but Peter Boghossian was, because it's the one true faith. He went into church father mode.
Okay.
And one of the ironies of that is Peter Boghossian, and I like him in lots of ways. I'm not trying to have a dig at him, believe it or not. So imagine whatever was really trying to slag someone off. But he does this Socratic method that you're fond of. He does street epistemology, he calls
Yeah,
it.
it's great.
So he goes out there and he does the Socratic method. The problem is we only know about the Socratic method through Plato. And Socrates never wrote anything.
Yeah.
So Plato wrote it all down. And then in, is it Phaedrus, he does this discussion over the difference between speech and writing, which Derrida analyzes in a book called Disseminations. But the interesting thing is, there are layers upon layers, because Plato was presenting almost like a poet his philosophical ideas.
Yeah.
And Peter Boghossian is reliant upon a borderline poet who gave him his philosophical method, while simultaneously insisting that science is the answer to everything.
Right.
So there's just, again, there's a performative contradiction. You should at least be aware of the origins of where some of your ideas come from.
Plato's pharmacy.
Yeah, the pharmacon. And the interesting thing is the pharmacon.
What's that?
Well, the pharmacon is the word for drug.
Oh.
And writing was compared to a, this is the interesting thing. It was depending on the translation, like in English, a drug can be a good medical drug or a poison.
Right.
And in Greek, it means poison, drug in the Western sense, cure. It also interestingly means scapegoat.
Oh,
So the cure for a society was to send someone out.
interesting.
Could you get these interesting...
And this is what I'm saying about postmodernism, why it's fascinating. It goes back, and it's got all these layers that Ed doesn't like,
No,
because it's ambiguous.
I don't like them. I don't
Well,
say
now you don't, because you're coming around to my way of thinking.
No, I'm
I've
simply
seen the
thinking...
glint in your eye.
No,
I've seen it.
you saw that glint in... the same glint your mother saw in the milkman's eye, I imagine. No, I think it is... I think it is...
You sure you can spare it?
What he's saying in Plato's Pharmacy is that there is an inherent uncertainty to language, and I've never that's not something I'd ever deny. It's an imperfect tool for negotiating the world, but it is a tool and it is a useful one. I don't think it's an amazingly original thing that he's highlighting. I think what he does do, and I don't know if I would compare this to the art actually, and that's where perhaps if philosophy is about things. If philosophy is about discussing questions like what can we know, what can we actually know, and trying to gain some kind of purchase or certainty on what we can actually know,
that's
what are reasonable questions to be
But that's
asked.
not the skeptic of epistemology. That's what I'm trying to introduce, the distinction. Rorty would say philosophy, and Heidegger said the same. Philosophy took a wrong turn when, like science, and this is not dissing science, it's saying science is at its strongest when it is trying to describe the subjective reality. But Rorty has an interesting notion of
objective reality.
Objective reality, out there with causality. And Rorty has this fascinating, he says, objective realism is A, the belief in causal relations. That's science. Science can test that to the gills, and it's brilliant at it. But there's a normative element, which Ed is drenched in. And the normative element is you should do this.
Like
and
a normative bukkake.
That's the church. That's the church father element of it all. It's objective realism is great when it's about causal relations, but the minute you try and force it onto everything, that's when it becomes normative and prescriptive. And Rorty argues we inherited with the church fathers, we got told what good things to do.
Yes.
With the Enlightenment, we got told what good things to think and say.
Yes.
And the woke, if you trace it all the way down, one lineage I would say is they've adopted the performative elements of knowing the right things to say and think in the worst possible way. So just like postmodernists can be misrepresented, the good aspect of Enlightenment science has been bastardized by the woke.
How would you reply to that, Ed?
When you say it's normative, you mean that...
Well, if we take it away from you, Peter Boghossian in this interview with Bentz, he basically argues that science should be used for everything. And my point about Plato's Pharmakon, it was, but you're getting this idea of science and the Socratic method from someone who wrote it all down in a Derridean type way. So, you know, pay a bit of respect to the guy who was a bit like Derrida, who gave you your technique. That's why I'm saying there's a bit of reflexivity needed.
So you'll say, so that's an interesting point. So you're saying that, philosophy itself, which is about understanding, I don't know, the nature of knowledge or whatever, or what we can know, is founded by a man who was a bit of a trickster, like Derrida.
And furthermore, philosophy went wrong when it imitated science. So in a way, I'm being respectful.
So when did philosophy imitate science?
When it began to think, especially with Descartes and Kant, when it began to think there was a pure, objective reality to be described, and it can be
Wasn't
contained...
that what Plato was saying?
Well, partially, but the point was there wasn't the Enlightenment in Plato's time. What Rorty's saying is it all kicked off. Science and philosophy were thinking along the same lines in the Enlightenment. And Rorty's point is, leave science to the scientists. An element of pragmatism is science is great in its area. Philosophy shouldn't waste its time because you're never going to understand the ineffable.
Isn't that what then... So does that imply that metaphysics is a complete waste of time?
According to Rorty, yes.
I would agree, basically, because they're coming up with these rationalist theories where they try to describe the nature of the world, which they seem to somehow intuit, like Hegel.
Yeah.
And there's no scientific evidence for them at all. So it's basically philosophy turning into a kind of religious belief.
And that's my point. Do you see how that can relate to woke? When philosophy is the undergirding aspect of modern society like that, this allows identity people to say, I am this, I am a bloody wolf now. And because I think it, that is enough. It's a stretch, but the lineage is back to Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Now it's, I think I am a fairy wolf. Therefore, you will have to make accommodations for me at school.
I suppose another way of looking at it is to say that if you have a postmodern view which asserts that there's no such thing, which in its straw man form or whatever, but there is no such thing as objective truth. You know, Meghan Markle, we all have our truth. Then this leads you to a world almost of solipsism, in which you can't. The only thing you can know is that you're you. And so then, in a sense, it's almost like you are. There's nothing outside you necessarily. You
narcissism.
Sorry,
it's narcissism.
Well, yes, but
we got there in the end.
You are. He had to.
Narcissism bingo. Anyone who had 80 minutes.
Everyone, take a drink. You are God. You define, or we are all little gods. We are all little, it's Gnostic. We are all little chinks of light in the darkness, and we define ourselves. And then there are these bad chinks of light that say, no, there's objective standards, and you can't define who you are, and they upset us.
Well, Ed, I'm agreeing with you up to this point. This is scaring me. I don't feel normal now. But one way out of this is Rorty's idea. He says there are different vocabularies. So the way to stop the solipsism, one of his books was called Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. So he said irony is a private thing. It's about doubt. It's about these type of postmodern questionings. But he said on the social level, it should be old-fashioned liberal democracy, try and look out for your fellow human being. And the notion about vocabularies is an interesting one. He said, for example, if there's a father and the son's hiding under the bed, or the son says to the father, there's a monster under the bed, will you get rid of it? If the father starts shouting at the boy, don't be so bloody ridiculous, you're being irrational. Can you see how that's the inappropriate register? And it's a bad example in a sense because there's a power relation there.
Yeah.
But if you can think of a more or less power differential.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
The point is about people have different vocabularies.
Sure.
So Rorty's point is we need to work on the vocabularies. It means that we can talk sense to each other.
Yes.
I think you
and that is the way to avoid solipsism. That's the way to avoid. Meghan Markle's only talking to herself.
Yeah, no, I mean, sorry to bring it back around psychology again, but this is therapy. You've got to meet the client where they are. You don't. If you berate them, you're only going to further entrench them in their delusion.
I'm sorry, could you give Ed more time? But could I just finish this point? Because what you've just said also about, reminded me about therapy. One of the aspects about therapy, correct me if I'm wrong, is it's a personal narrative.
Yes.
And part of my theory is that when you lose linguistic facility, when you lose the ability to use language, how are people even going to tell therapists their own story? If they don't have literature to draw upon, if they don't have films, or they don't have a way to talk about
That's a very good point. Yeah, so the this is the interesting thing with sort of comprehending one's life story, with making sense of who one is. And the way that historically everyone did that was everyone, either through reading it or through being preached to about it once a week, knew the Bible, and they could compare themselves to people in the Bible, and therefore this gave them a means of what's the word I want? Not weighting oneself, of giving oneself a grounding in the world. Where I am like Job at the moment. I am like Cretius at the moment. I am like whatever biblical character, because there are many dimensions to the Bible, but one of them is that it's just a lot of stories about human beings with their different character dimensions and so forth, or Shakespeare plays. This is another example, and you have to have things. Freud drew upon Greek myth. You have to have these kinds of things to have a grounding and a sense of who you are. And if you don't have them, then you can't. How can you make a clear narrative of what your life has been like if you don't have figures to whom you can compare yourself, which your interlocutor also knows about? And there's real danger of a polarizing microcosm sort of society is that you don't have that.
And worse than that, if I may add, this idea of the way power can be a generative force, it sounds wishy-washy and postmodern, etc. But with my fledgling dip into YouTube, what I found fascinating is, for the first time, I've seen how the statistics work. So the type of stuff I want to do, I don't want quick clicks, because I'm trying to get someone to go into a long... But you two know, I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs. The whole structure is to get quick clicks. Well, but that creates Ed in a cravat wearing wigs. That creates... It creates how we act.
It does. It's is that called audience? That's audience capture, isn't it? It's audience capture.
But that generates the power dynamic in YouTube. Makes content producers work in a certain way.
Exactly. The title and the thumbnail are so important.
It's everything.
Key.
It's everything.
Which is why I'm doing the exact opposite.
And you'll get nothing.
And I'm priding myself on my low levels. But sorry, one last thing though, and what I'm doing.
This is what you mean by this is what it means in postmodern thinking. Power is generative.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm getting it now. So
it's not power. It isn't just oppressive. Power generates.
Yes. Okay.
So Ed's ability to wear wigs and women's clothing on occasion in front of the camera is empowering to Ed.
Well, yeah, it does.
But he wouldn't do it. It wouldn't be socially acceptable if YouTube's power dynamic wasn't encouraging Ed's latent repressed aspects to come out on camera.
Right. Yes.
I think it's a very interesting point that the idea that the philosophy itself, which is supposed to be a logical, rational kind of action where you try to understand from first principles fundamental questions such as what can we know, or is there a God, or whatever, is founded by a person that just liked to annoy people by asking lots of questions. And that I think it's interesting to say that Derrida was the kind of person that liked to annoy people by asking lots of questions. So he's the great, almost like unphilosophical founder of philosophy. How can I put that? Freud's the great unanalyzed analyzer. He's the great unphilosophical founder of philosophy. The paradoxical thing. In the same way that the Western civilization, which has reached these scientific heights based around rational thinking, logic, reason, whatever, was ultimately founded by people that had very little of that, and that were extreme. Some like founded by Moses. He was logical in some ways, but basically a genius, a group level genius, a group level adaptation. It's got nothing to do with whether things are empirically true. It's to do with God, and it's to do with his own charisma. And yet ultimately he founds it, and that you have to have that paradox that to defend the space like this, where we can have or what we try to have anyway, a reasoned logical discussion. You have to.
I think we did, Ed.
Well, to some extent, but we'll have an even more
pessimist, isn't it?
You have to have people that are very illogical, that are motivated by religion, motivated by ethnocentrism, and will die to defend us from the enemy at the gate, which they're not doing, of course, which means that it's more and more difficult to have reasoned discussions because we're taken over by tyranny. But so that's an interesting paradox, I thought.
So I'm just going to feed back what I thought I heard you say. As the boundaries break down, as the things are allowed to sink deeper into their solipsism, we have more tyranny.
Well, perhaps that's true.
But that wasn't. Oh, okay.
Well, it's a good point, because how can you relate to somebody else if you are increasingly solipsistic? How can you and therefore what do you do other than see them as a threat if you can't in any way relate to them or come to any kind of shared vantage point with them?
But there's also, sorry.
I was just going to say, to your point about language before, this is the thing, what you've just said, I'm supposed to moderate, I'm not supposed to be talking, but it annoys me when people say, let people use the language they want to use. And I say, no, that tears at the fabric of reality, because if we three have our own individual lexicon, how the fuck am I supposed to know what you mean when you say chair? I would literally have to read your dictionary, and you both have to read mine. We have no middle ground in which we can meet.
And I think why, because you asked earlier about Jordan Peterson, but when he talks about the postmodern neo-Marxists in a completely inaccurate way, it reminds me of the Cathy Newman interview he did. Why that was so viral, millions must have seen that. So what you're saying is, but of all people, he's now doing that to the postmodernists. So what you're saying, Derrida, is, no, Derrida wasn't. So try harder. Cathy Newman should have resigned the minute that interview finished. But journalists, and this is, again, the problem with the woke, is that the very people who are truly postmodernist are the journalists. But they honestly are relativists. Postmodernists aren't. They're relativists in a nuanced, subtle way that actually isn't relativist when you dig down. So journalists are.
So there's a barbarian postmodernist then, and that's the journalist.
Well, then yeah, we have to use these terms because postmodernism has been bastardized. But Cathy Newman was basic, and recently, I think we've discussed this off camera, but Laura Koenigsberg, she's interviewing Kemi Badenoch, and she was holding Kemi Badenoch to account because Kemi Badenoch was implying some cultures are better than others. And I think it's clumsy to say some cultures are better than others because it depends which culture you're in and what you value. But there's a definite way of saying which culture would you prefer to live in and which culture is less oppressive in certain ways. And Laura Koenigsberg was basically forbidding Kemi Badenoch to say that. And if they're not doing that, if they're not precluding you from saying the obvious because you'll get a pile on, they're practicing what I call gotcha journalism.
Yes.
And then they say politicians are like robots. Well, you've created a public space where discussion, there's either a pile on because you've said something out of order,
or you're a robot,
or you act like a robot in order to avoid that, and now you're a robot. And I don't understand why the public at large, and maybe they have, because I think journalists, with noble exceptions, I know a few who are great, but the majority of journalists have gone along like Pravda. And they're engaged in this. And then you get people like Andrew Gold kicking back against it.
That's very interesting. So you can say that the postmodern theorists have developed almost fundamentalist followers. So it's like a Christianity that is I don't know the original fundamentalism that developed at the beginning of the 19th century. You could argue 20th century, sorry, and that's quite modernist. But they weren't doing things like saying that dinosaurs never existed.
Well, can I give you a very specific example? And then I'll shut up for a bit.
Yeah.
I wrote a book back in the day. It was an academic book, so not a big seller, called Critical Theories of Mass Media Then and Now. And it did what it said on the tin. It looked at Frankfurt School and critical Marxist theorists of technology and brought it up to date by using examples like reality TV. And this was when reality TV had just come out. And I was sent a review of my book by the House magazine of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And I had to go to my local fish and chip shop where there was an Iranian lady who read Farsi.
Really?
And she translated it for me. So this idea, do you honestly think, Ed probably thinks I am, but do you honestly think I'm linked with the Ayatollahs?
Not really, no.
But this is how you work, this is how the postmodernists...
This is how they work. Well, they're not. It's just also just bad reasoning. It's just rhetoric. So
but the point is how you can be misappropriating, and the postmodern theorists have been.
Okay, so what you're basically saying is that you just have people that are stupid and dogmatic, and they have taken aspects of postmodernism.
Well, this is where we're going into your territory, because this is right in your fields. I'm giving you a free hit over the main stand.
All right.
If 50% of the population, and likely in future increasing, goes to university, guess what? The standard of IQ goes down, and the staff, more importantly, the staff who teach them are recruited from a much bigger pool, And because there's an overproduction of PhD students deliberately, they work for peanuts and they will toe the party line if one job is dangled at them.
Yes.
The minute they enter, so you're teaching less intelligent students, which you could measure, and thereby ideologically captured PhD students going for their first job who are chuffed to have a job. And it's a recipe.
And it's a short. They almost never have a lifetime contract, so they can be sacked.
Yeah.
They can be sacked for saying the wrong thing or whatever. And so it's just it's ending. I mean, the AI revolution is going to substantially end universities anyway, because there's going to be all these degrees that we won't need.
Well, as I was leaving it, I could teach Derrida, and the whole trans thing hadn't really hit. But I can imagine a scenario where I'm showing how Derrida and Foucault would be vehemently against trans ideology, and I wouldn't be allowed to teach that. But it's in Foucault.
But it's there.
It's there. I could find
What does he
it.
say?
Well, about this thing about identity, Foucault would say he's against fetishizing identity. Because
You went a bit Zizek then, fetishizing.
Fetishizing. I sound like Sean Connery. Fetishization. Money penny. Do you get my point? That you actually, it just becomes, this is what you're doing.
We have 8 minutes. You took some notes. Please cover them.
Oh no, I've been drawing upon the notes all along.
Do you know Slavoj Zizek?
No.
No. Did you watch the Zizek-Peterson debate?
No.
It's not your type of thing.
Look, if they want me to interview him, I'll interview him. But I'm not familiar.
Pay to see
Then I will. Then
that would be amazing.
Then I will swat up.
Then you'll swat up.
So yeah, I'm perfectly happy to go to Slovenia and talk to this fellow.
I think you'd like him. I honestly, he's a lovely, lovely guy. And he's intellectually curious. That's his only motivation.
Good.
And I'll tell you one quick story. I was his unofficial tour manager. I took him around 3 universities, Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool. And basically his factotum, whatever you call it. And I remember we needed to catch a train, and I was really trying to get him moving. You do this all the time. And he spoke to a PhD student. So there are all these the great and the good in this room. And he spoke for 20 minutes with a PhD student because the PhD student had a really interesting question. And he didn't give a toss about the important people. And that is very rare.
He's non-pretentious.
Yeah, that's my clumsy way of saying it. I don't think I would have been that noble.
Yeah.
I think I would have been, my head turned by all these famous people wanting to speak to me. And he really genuinely doesn't care.
God bless him.
So that's what I like about him.
Closing statements, gentlemen. Postmodernism is woke depravity. Mr. Ed Dutton, what do you think?
I don't think they're exactly the same thing.
No.
No.
How would
Agreed on that.
How would what's your most up to date definition of woke? How would you define it now? I mean, obviously you're in this battle all the time.
It seems to be it's the new in word. It's becoming obviously increasingly a sort of shut up word of the right. But it's the new in word for essentially for Gramscian cultural Marxism. I mean, that's basically what it is.
Yeah.
But it's added on to that very strongly. This idea that you, as Paul was saying, that you your worldview is based around a certain grievance identity, which is not inherent to Marxism, but maybe it's implied because you're part of a repressed group or a suppressed group. So it's that you have a grievance identity and you fight for the good of that grievance identity, rather than just that your identity is based around something, and it's you that decides on that identity as well. So you define yourself like God does, so it's therefore reducible to a kind of solipsism or whatever, that you create yourself.
They say narcissism.
All right, narcissism, fine. It's reducible to a kind of narcissism where the difference is that if in that sense you can reduce it to psychology. Yeah, you could say it's the psychology of extremely neurotic people who deal with their neuroticism by developing a sort of narcissistic personality where they are completely at the center, but almost a vulnerable narcissistic personality.
Absolutely.
Where they are the most aggrieved subgroup, and everything has to be done therefore to give them what they want, which is ultimately power and control.
Yes. Closing statements, Dr. Paul Taylor.
I wish I'd said earlier, because it's just come to me, I've written it down, but I wish I'd mentioned bureaucracy earlier. Because I think it's in Lyotard's original report in 1979, The Postmodern Condition. He actually describes how our society's become an information society and how that feeds technocratic organizations. So then he says, the original ends of a lot of organizations have completely forgotten, and it becomes the maintenance, the optimal performance of the self-generating system. So it's like solipsism on a organizational level. And it makes me think of terrible instances of people in the NHS, whistleblowers, who've had their careers ruined for telling the truth. And that the doctors who've spent years doing their dream job being sacked for actually trying to help patients by telling the truth, because the managers in the NHS are all powerful.
Yeah.
And that bureaucratic control of technocracy, leading back to the discussion we had about how could conservatives make use of postmodernism, I think the common ground should be leftists, rightists, conservatives. These groups should unify in a hatred for technocrats, because they are apolitical and they are solipsistic narcissists who have the levers of power. And I think it's a lot of straw man arguments on both sides. We're focusing on, I will disagree with Ed on lots of things, and with you, less so, because we disagree too much. But I will never disagree with Ed's intellectual curiosity and his willingness to have a discussion.
Yeah. Oh, in principle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll go and have a drink.
Yeah.
It's not a problem, but
Yeah.
you cannot reason with technocrats.
No.
And guess what? They're the higher echelons. The lower echelons, the pond feeders at the bottom, they are the woke.
Well, the worst
who
thing
don't
is,
have an argument.
The worst thing is, the woke is that you can't have a disagreement with them and then go for a drink.
Yeah, but why that is, I'm trying to make these links with illiteracy. The technocracy does not need literacy. And people like me and you are driven out the university system because whatever our faults, we're highly literate, we're very well read, and there is no, ironically, that is the worst place to be if you're well read and opinionated as a university. How can that have happened?
One of the very big problems that the strongest argument is facing now in its infancy is getting people from different sides of the spectrum to argue. And I'm not simping for the right wing. I'm not right wing, but right wingers invite me to dinner, take me for drinks. I'll tell them where I disagree with them, where I think they're wrong, and they usually just smile and go, "That's okay." And then we have a chat
They're
about
not intellectually motivated.
There's a robustness there that isn't there on the left.
They're more mentally stable. That's why.
Take
it personally.
It's a psychological problem.
Yeah, but then my argument would be, you're the scientist, what's the cause of that? And one of my causal explanations would be illiteracy. For all the reasons you said about lacking a narrative. If they go to a therapist, what do they say to the therapist? They're borderline. They functionally can't speak.
We have a very short period of time, but it's relevant to the conversation we've had. Getting feedback from therapists, there seems to be a growing crisis in therapy because people can't define what it is. They can't form a narrative. Quick example. I spoke to a woman at a seminar. She said, "I don't know what to say to my therapist." So I said to her, "This is what I say to my therapist. Now, what would you say to your therapist?" And she fed back what I had just said to her. There was so little going on in terms of narrative and structure building. She just took what I said to her 30 seconds before.
But don't you see that as an encapsulation of she's looking at a screen reading stuff and it's going back into the screen?
Was it Foucault, I can't remember, that argued that there was some difference between, like, some sort of brain damage, and it leads to an inability to articulate your thoughts properly. And there's one kind of damage which means that if I were to say, I don't know, light bulb, you'd say fire, so an association. And another kind of damage where if I were to say light bulb, you'd say something that was the shape of it or something. What was this?
Oh, it's not synesthesia. That's
There's
colours and sensations.
Yeah, there is
but
this.
There's something very similar.
And he looked into that. Yeah. And he said that this is the breakdown of the ability to describe your world. This is, that's what. Once you're in that situation, you can't describe your world. Then it sends you completely mad, basically.
Well, we have got social-wide dyslexia now. That's what's scary.
Agreed. Gentlemen, we are at time, so where can people find you?
They can find me on the Jolly Heretic, which is on YouTube, and they can find me on the Jolly Heretic, which is on Substack, where I put all the more kind of based and edgy stuff, and where they can help support me if that's what they want to do.
We'll put your links in the description. And you, sir?
I've just started Readers of the Lost Art. So philosophy, paintings, poetry. You've read a couple.
I've read a couple of them out in my miserable Scouse voice for you, yeah.
Which is better than my Mardy Ringo Star. And no, it's for people who don't mind dark, depressing stuff that actually, if you spend long enough with it, can be life-affirming.
Absolutely. Agreed, 100%. And I highly recommend both of you. Plus, we regularly do the Jolly Heretic podcast together.
We do on Mondays at 7 p.m. UK time.
It's the same sort of thing, but with more cock jokes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and for your attention. This has been The Strongest Argument. I am Richard Grannon, and we look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Thank you.